let's do this. Well, welcome everyone to this, I'll call it a data lounge session. Really appreciate everyone's time coming on board during this difficult time, and we really hope everyone enjoy the session. So hopefully you can all see my screen. Just wanted to quickly introduce MindFULL. So at MindFULL, our why is we love helping our customers make sense of this crazy fast changing world. That's our why, that gets us up every morning. And it couldn't be more truer in these times. So at MindFULL, we are very passionate about what we do. We love all the data work we do, the planning work. We strip it back, and we really keep it real for all of our customers. So really, this is what drives every little mindful person that you'll deal with out there. Just wanted to quickly introduce the speakers. You've got Paul here. Paul works he's the CEO of EverEdge. They're a global asset advisory, valuation, and transactional specialist business. Paul's been ranked as one of the top intellectual property strategists in the world over the last 8 years, which is phenomenal. Paul's also a recipient of the Global IP Leader Award in 2012. And prior to EverEdge, he served as an intellectual property manager for Brunswick Technology. He's also the founder and incubator manager of the Icehouse Incubator, named by Forbes magazine as one of the top 10 incubators of the world. So, wow, really impressive. Carl Harris, he's the Informatica country manager, also an amazing guy. Carl used to be a statistician, which most of you would not have guessed. But over the last 20 years, Carl's really engrossed himself in data analytics and the IT space. And he's been working with some very large global software businesses and works with a range of industries, helping them through their data journey and to become data-driven. Belinda Johnson, I'm the CEO of MindFULL. I used to be an accountant in a previous life, a chartered accountant, and then have been a CFO in a property development company, and have joined MindFULL and fallen in love with technology over the last 16 years. You've got Graham Jackson there as well. Graham is our data client executive from MindFULL. Graham was an engineer, and he specializes in end-to-end data management and advanced analytics. He's worked in some very large banks and have done some really cool stuff with data. He's also worked at FMCG and energy and utility businesses. And Graham really is focusing on bringing those value-added data solutions to New Zealand. William Brunswick, who won't talk today, but he's our enterprise data architect who have worked on some of the examples. We're going to talk to you guys a little bit later on. All right, so that's us in a nutshell. MindFULL, who we are. We're excited that everyone's been able to join us through these difficult times, and hope you really get a lot of value out of today's session. So I'm going to pass you guys over now to Paul, who's going to take us through data valuation. And we're just going to turn our videos off for the rest of the presenters so we can focus on Paul.
Great. Well, thank you everybody, and with a little bit of luck you should be able to see that. So jump straight into this, and I'm going to very quickly, sorry, all right, now get rid of that. Okay, so I want to very quickly jump into who we are briefly. So EverEdge is an intangible asset specialist. So we like to say we deal with all of the assets inside of a business that you can't drop on your foot. So things like data, content, brands, code, that kind of thing. We've been around for 12 years. We've done over, it's actually 1,000 client engagements now, and very successful in doing so. Return on client fees is about 10x, which means for every dollar that we get given by a client, we are able to give them about $10 in value back. And clients range from everyone from the very largest companies, 160 billion, all the way down to startups and so forth. So enough about us. Let's talk a little bit about data and intangible assets. Well, what you see on your screen here is the balance of the S&P 500, so the broadest measure of the market, over the last 40 years, split between tangible and intangible assets. And what we can see over that period is clearly all value has shifted into intangibles. It's about 87% now. If we look at the top 5 companies by market cap, it's about 99% of their intangible. If we look at most startups, they're about 99% intangible as well. Most tech companies are typically about 95% as well. So basically all value shifted into intangible assets. And those intangible assets are everywhere. They're not in just the things that people traditionally think of, such as patents and trademarks, but they're in a whole host of different asset types, systems, processes, regulatory approval, software code, and clearly data is another big one. And what's interesting about these assets is that they are now the primary drivers of virtually all company performance. If we look in where companies actually earn their earnings growth from, it's almost universally driven out of their intangible assets rather than their fixed assets. So We're going to talk about data today, and this is a famous cover on The Economist a couple of years ago, talking about how data was now, in fact, more valuable than the world's oil resources, and is definitely probably the case right now, given that people are having to pay to have oil put back into the ground right now. So we know that data is extremely valuable. But I'm going to start with talking about the way that it appears on balance sheets. And that's relevant because a lot of folks, when they talk about data, they really don't know how to value it. And one of the places people sometimes go, well, how does it turn up on the balance sheet? And the reality is the balance sheet is typically meaningless for the valuation of data. And there's a very famous case involving Caesar's Palace. And Caesar's Palace was originally PE and hedge fund backed. It failed to perform post the GFC, it fell into bankruptcy, and one of the hedge funds that had backed it took control of this otherwise ignored asset, which is 30 years worth of gambling data. Now, it was not recorded on the balance sheet, and the creditors sued, and there was this question about how much is the data worth. And what they found ultimately was that the data was valued at roughly $1 billion, and it ended up being the highest value asset, in fact, in the entire group. So let's talk a little bit closer to home. Qantas. Now, Qantas almost goes bankrupt in the late 2000s. Hopefully it doesn't go bankrupt again. And data was regarded as a very undertapped and undervalued resource. And Qantas put a lot of focus on its data monetization efforts. The program was very, very successful. And in 2008, it generated an underlying EBIT for the airline of $372 million and a profit margin of 24%. Now, just to put that in context, that means Qantas was making 4 times the margin selling data than it was on flying people around the world. And in those data margins, and the data business in general was growing at 7 times the speed of the rest of the business. And why this is relevant is that basically data saved Qantas. Right? And in fact, it ended up being valued at roughly half the value of the airline. But again, it's off balance sheet. Right? And this is very important because what you'll typically find is that data is not well captured within financial statements. And this is true more broadly of intangible assets. That intangible assets are typically off balance sheet. They're not captured within those financial statements. And that is problematic when it comes to justifying projects around data, because there's this big question mark about what are they worth and what value are they going to deliver for us. And so that's where we do a lot of work with clients, is helping them to understand exactly what that stuff is worth and what kind of revenue, what kind of margins, etc. is likely to drive for people. So if your question is how do you value data? Well, I can start by telling you how not to do it. Right? So the first way is to not take this approach, which is, well, we see this from a lot of companies. They say, well, we have heaps of data and it simply must be worth something. So let's just monetize it. In other words, they immediately leap out and simply start monetization of the data without even asking some fundamental questions around, okay, is this going to pay off? Is it going to be worth it? What are the risks? What are the costs, etc.? Now, a second common methodology is this one, is to say something along the lines of, well, each piece of data cost me $10, or I make $10 from it. That'd be a revenue side approach. And I have 10 million pieces of data, so my data is worth $100 million. And some of you might be laughing at this, but we've literally seen this approach from folks. Or they'll go onto the internet and find some comparable and say, well, therefore, I have 10 million of these pieces of data and the internet says it's worth $5 each, so I've got $50 million worth of data. And this brings us to that third point. All of these approaches are how not to value data, and for the reasons that I'm just about to get into. But please don't do it this way, I guess is the thing I'd like to say. So if we want to understand what data is worth, then, and I'm sure as the Economist picked up on it, and people will know, there's this argument that data is kind of like oil. And to a certain extent, it is true. And that, first of all, data is only potentially valuable, right? So if a gusher suddenly spikes in your backyard, it's only potentially valuable. There's a lot of things that need to happen before data goes from your backyard into a barrel and creates value for somebody down the line, essentially, right? And we can see that right now, as I said, that people are having to pay to essentially take oil off their hands. So when it's in its raw form, it's only potentially valuable. Secondly, there's a cost to extract it. Right? So there's a cost associated with the extraction of value from data. And this is why understanding what the value of the data is so important, because unless we understand one side of the equation, the value side, we can't understand whether the cost side makes sense. Third, there's also very significant damage can be done in the process of extracting value from data. And we've seen numerous cases of where things have blown up for companies when they've gone through this process, oftentimes not in the technical side, but really more on the from the market side, the brand side, etc. When companies have been found out to be harvesting and doing things with data that really they probably cannot explain to their customers. So data in this regard is actually, to a certain extent, similar to oil. And I guess the key point here is that the value of data is almost entirely dependent on the business context and the economic returns and the risks of monetizing that data. So we cannot look at data in and of itself as being a resource that has a value, an intrinsic value. Its data, its value comes from context and the business context. So to value data accurately, you basically need to identify end use cases. And so that's really the starting point of valuing any piece of data, is to say, look, what are the end use cases for that data? How can I put that data to work? So for example, maybe I have a set of traffic data, and one potential end use case for that traffic data could be enabling live routing around traffic jams, right? So once we understand that end use case, we can then begin to build a business model associated with that end use case. So we might, for example, charge a subscription model for that live routing around traffic jams, or we could even do it a charge per use, right? But that's then starting to convert a set of data into something we can generate value from. And then once we understand this business model, we're then able to build a business case. And the business case is all of the typical things you'll see within a business case. We look at revenue, we look at cost, we look at risk, we look at time, we look at cost of capital. What this valuation enables is that, first of all, it enables you to understand the potential economic return from that data asset in that context. In other words, we have this big data set, traffic data. It could be used in many, many different ways. But what we've done by going through this process is we've now understood how that data is going to be used in that specific context. Secondly, it enables us to justify the investment required to deploy that business case. So if I'm going to my CFO, for example, if I'm the CTO and I say, look, I've got this data set and I want to spend $5 million putting it into a form that I can then use it in. Any normal CFO should ask the question of, well, what is that going to be worth, right? If you want to spend $5 million, what do I get back for that $5 million? Because if the answer is 500,000, then clearly that's not a good idea. If the answer is 100 million, then clearly that's a fantastic idea. And you simply cannot do that without going through this process of understanding your data set, understanding all the end use cases, building business models, and then building a business case for each specific end use case. And this also enables you to evaluate the return that you're going to get from that data versus the cost associated with extracting it, and also the risk. And this is a factor that is often overlooked by people. They look at maybe this and this, but they don't look at this a lot of the time. So the business model is really the key here, and that is data is only valuable fundamentally when deployed via a business model that generates value. And this is one of the mistakes that we see that companies make a lot, is that they will say something like, well, I have this data set and it covers this extraordinary amount of area or particular consumer population, etc. It must be valuable. Well, the answer is, only if it's deployed in a business model that generates value. If it is never deployed, then ultimately it doesn't have any value. Now, it may not be valuable in your hands, it may be valuable in somebody else's, but ultimately it has to end up having its value extracted through that business model. And if we look at it, there are 4 fundamental models by which you can extract value in the data game. There are data users, right? So these are people like Thara or Amazon. And what they do is they use data to inform decisions and deliver better products. And some of that data is their own and some of it they purchase in. Then you have your data suppliers. And so these are people like Equifax and Nielsen, et cetera. And they gather and they aggregate and they ultimately sell data to other people. Those data users are the first group, right? And then you have your data delivery networks. And what they're really essentially doing is using data to deliver a better advertising platform, better targeting, et cetera, of advertising to people ultimately in products and services. And then finally, you have your data facilitators. And so these are the people who are selling the picks and shovels, who are to everybody else who's going around digging for the oil or the gold in the ground, fundamentally, right? So they supply the tools and the infrastructure to collect and analyze and store the data. But generally what you'll find is that your business model is going to fall into one of those four categories. And then underneath that, there's going to be a whole lot of very specific context. So the model that we've built to help companies to really build these business cases is something that we call the DAISY model. And it's a model that we built because we found that so many people really didn't know how to attack this problem. And it's significantly deeper than what I'm going to show you here, because we only have a short space of time, but it will give you a sense of how do you go about building a business case around these things, and what are the factors you need to look at. So, and it'll become clear why we call it the DAISY model in a second. The first thing is that you need to evaluate your data quality. And that data quality fundamentally can be analyzed along three key axes: technical, legal, and risk. So technical factors are going to be many of the factors that Belinda and her team are going to be able to talk to you about. So things like consistency and relevancy and accuracy and currency, and a whole lot of technical factors around the nature of the data itself. The second group of factors are what we call legal factors, and these are things like, well, do you have a legal ownership of that data, which is a big question many people actually don't ask, and they should, which is, do we actually own this data? And there are very, very substantial issues there, what they call chain of title issues. Their issues are, do we have an entitlement to use it? If we collected it for purpose A, we actually allowed to use it for purpose B, because if our business model is about purpose B, but we collected it for purpose A, we may not have a legal entitlement to use it for that purpose. There are the regulatory factors that we need to take into account, privacy factors, etc. So there's a whole lot of factors inside legal. And then the third factor under data quality is risk. So in other words, and these are oftentimes, as I said, reputational risks. So what happens when we might have great data, high technical quality, we might be allowed to do this from a consumer perspective or a legal perspective. What happens when our consumers find out we've done this? Are we going to be upset? Are they going to be upset with us, for example? So all of those things go to data quality. Once we've evaluated the data quality, that's going to influence the kind of end use cases that we can actually put that data to. If we don't have sufficiently high quality data, we may not be able to achieve certain end use cases. Once we've done that, we then go to building business cases. And so we build a business case, and here you can see why we call it the DAISY model. We build a business case for each end use case, and the size and the number of business end use cases. So the size of each one of these business cases gives you a sense of the sort of value of that particular data, right? And we start stacking them up. So we might have one data set here in the middle. We understand its data quality, and it might represent, for example, 9 different end use cases. Once we have done that, we can actually then start to look at the value of the data as a whole overall, right? So just tapping through here. We can then, once we've done that, we can then look at the synergies between different end use cases. So we can say, right, we've got this data set in the middle and build a whole lot of end use cases around it. Now, some of those end use cases are going to have synergies with one another. In other words, if we modify the data in this way, it can serve both 2 different or 3 different end use cases, for example, or the infrastructure that we use to achieve that end use case can be used on another end use case, for example. So what that means, by taking this model, what it's done is it's taken an enormous data set that we might have, and which is really, really difficult to value, and it's actually broken it down into a format that we can actually start to value. And so what it does, the benefits of the DAISY model is that, first of all, it tells you how your data quality impacts or can entirely prevent different end use cases or monetization cases entirely, right? Secondly, it can tell you exactly what the value of a specific end use case is. So we can look at just one end use case and say, this is what it's worth. Then it can also say, what is the whole lot worth together? So we can look at the entire data set and see what it's worth. And then finally, we can take into account those synergies. And this is useful because what it then does is it enables management to start doing cost benefit analysis and risk analysis. And you can compare end use cases as well. So you can say, well, this end use case is going to cost us this much. It's going to generate a return on investment of this much. This end use case is going to cost us this much, going to generate a different return on investment. And that enables us to now objectively determine which end use cases to invest in. So what does this look like in practice? I'll give you 3 quick case studies, and then I'm going to pass the ball on to the next presenter. So this was a client who had been around for about 30 years, and they were selling their business. It was in the financial services industry. The investment bank managing the transaction did the very classic investment banking thing of multiplying EBITDA times 4 and saying this is what you're worth. And we looked at what they were doing, and we realized that actually the most valuable asset in this whole business was its data. Now that data was off balance sheet, so it was not talked about in the financial statements, was not being talked about in the sales process at all. We took over that sales process and we did 2 things very differently. Number one, we valued that data up and we talked a lot about why the data was important. And number 2, we targeted companies who wanted to buy data, not who wanted to buy an operating business. And we outlined why that data would be valuable to them. So we built that DAISY model for each company. The company was ultimately purchased by a strategic buyer for 32 times EBITDA. So these guys got 8 times the money that they were expecting to get for the business because of an asset that was off balance sheet and nobody even really thought about. This one here was a company that was entering into a $50 million 50-50 joint venture. Both parties are contributing a bunch of intangible assets and the balance was going to be in cash. So each party was going to put in 25 million in cash each. Our client had collected very valuable data that was implemented via software. And there was this question that we put to the joint venture party was, well, our client's contributing very valuable intangible assets as well, so it should adjust the cash component of the transaction. In other words, our client should pay less cash. So we provided the valuation to the counterparty, and the counterparty was a very large US company, and they initially totally disagreed with the valuation. We said, well, that's fine. You tell us why this data is not important and valuable to you, and then we can strip it out of the JV if you need to. And they eventually came back and said, actually, you know what, the data is actually the heart of this, and this is why we want to do the JV in the first place. And so the consequence for our client, instead of needing to put in 25 million in cash, they only needed to put in 3 million in cash. So there, we saved them 22 million in cash because that value came from the data that was previously completely ignored. Last one, very quickly. This client had identified multiple different data feeds from its malls, and it needed to know how much that data was worth and should they monetize it. And so we went through a process of, we systematically to identify 19 different end use cases for that data. And we used the data quality to then rule in or rule out certain end use cases. And then we built those different end use cases and we're able to demonstrate to management the investment required, the payback, the total value, the risk adjusted return, etc. And what we've basically concluded is that the data is more valuable than the malls themselves. Right? The data is actually, that data asset is worth more to them than their malls, and it has completely revolutionized their whole way of thinking about their business. So, core conclusion here is really that data has the potential to deliver material economic returns to businesses, but those returns are completely context dependent. You have to look at the business context for each data end use case. Monetization comes with both significant costs and risks, and so therefore it's essential to value those returns and investment and risks before you start. Now, we're saving questions to the end, so I'm going to hand across now to my fellow presenters here, and we'll go from there. So I'm going to change presenter to Carl. Carl, it is over to you.
Thanks, Paul. Hopefully I'm back off mute.
Yes, you are.
And screen 2, and you can see my screen hopefully coming through.
Yep.
Perfect. Thanks.
Awesome.
Thanks, Paul.
Awesome. Thanks, Paul. I'm not sure actually how I follow a top internationally recognized IP strategist, to be fair, but I'll I'll give it a go. So look, Paul's great conversation there around the valuation of your data assets. What I want to do is follow on with that really in terms of, well, how practically do we understand what our data assets are and where do those reside? So Paul talked about, these intangible assets are everywhere. They're the primary drivers of company performance. And bear with me a second. I'm just going to move the screen. There we go. So we heard Paul talk about those intangible assets everywhere, and they're the primary drivers. The data asset's critical for businesses for many reasons. Many organizations are looking to transform and pivot their businesses. In order to do that, they need high quality data points to help them understand what business process improvement looks like, what new product introductions will be effective and resonate in market, what new business models will have you leading the pack at the end of the day and being disruptive in market as opposed to being disruptive. All of those require really solid, good quality, recognized data assets to underpin them. And you look at modern kind of customer examples around customer engagement. The obvious retail example that we look for is the next best offer, which Amazon really kind of led the charge on many years ago now, but every retailer is still trying to catch up with that. A really simple example of how data underpins critical digital transformation initiatives and customer engagement initiatives for organizations. Unfortunately, though, things aren't getting easier for us from a data landscape perspective. If we unpick what we're looking at there and try and value our assets, many of our data assets are not understood. We don't have clear definitions of where those assets reside, what they are, what the level of quality is. And of course, with the exponential growth in data that's coming through from different sources, big data, IoT, machine learning, device data, the network of data assets that we own is getting bigger and bigger and more complex. And at the same time, the consumers of data are growing exponentially as well. The people in our business who want data at hand readily to make decisions to drive the business forwards is growing. And by the way, their level of capability to technically source and manage data is obviously a lot lower than our traditional data scientists and business analysts that we're dealing with. So you put all those things together and suddenly, things are getting more complex for us from a data perspective. And then as Paul rightly said, there's legal and risk issues that we have to deal with every day. And depending what industry you're in, you'll have different regulatory requirements, whether it's things like you're dealing with European data citizens and you have to deal with GDPR or, Californian regulations, or whether you're in banking dealing with BS11 and APRA, et cetera, there is regulatory requirements that we have to meet as well. So it's a multi-layered data management issue that we're having to deal with. And by the way, if you get it wrong, the impact is quite significant, right? So, research recently showed that 69% of consumers globally would be prepared to boycott your brand if you didn't take their data protection seriously. And then, even if you did your utmost best to protect that data and manage that data, if hackers got in there, God forbid, and got access to your data, consumers will hold you liable, not the hacker. So 62% will blame the company first. So it's fraught with danger how we manage our data and govern that data and look after the privacy and security of that data. At the same time, trying to enable the business by empowering them with data to make decisions. So it's no wonder, you put all this together, it's no wonder that these complex conditions are creating a constantly moving data target for us. Many organizations still struggle to understand where the data is, where it resides, what that data is actually that they're holding, what quality is, and how they can use it. So to Paul's, opening comments, how can you understand the value of something if you can't actually find it and understand it in the first place? So of course, there's one other major technology driver that's happening in market, and with COVID happening right now, it's really interesting how this has escalated and come to the fore even further, and that's really around transition to cloud. So even if at a point in time you understand your data landscape in its entirety, you're one of those very few organizations that has a very clear picture of the data landscape. We now have this rapid data transition to cloud landscapes that's going on, and the expectation is by the end of this year, 83% of workloads will be residing in the cloud. 83% of workloads will be residing in the cloud. That's a massive transitional journey of your data assets. And so that creates another level of complexity because unfortunately, I think when cloud first arrived, people had this nirvana that one cloud would rule them all and they'll just put everything in the cloud. But the reality is that, of those customers using cloud to manage data, that 80% of them are using more than one cloud service provider. So, we all have the best intention, or we're an AWS shop, we're going to put all our data into AWS or Azure or GCP, whatever your flavor is. But what happens in reality is that, we're going to deploy Salesforce.com over here, and we're going to deploy that on AWS, but we run everything else. We've got Office 365 on Azure. We've got this piece here over on Azure. We're going to do our marketing stuff on Google Cloud Platform. So the reality is we're working in a multi or polycloud, depending which your vernacular you prefer. We're working a multi-cloud strategy. And at the same time, of course, we have all our hybrid all our on-premises landscape as well, which hasn't suddenly gone away. We're in a transitionary phase, and some applications we may never move, and some data we may never move for data sovereignty and data security and data privacy requirements. So we're in a multi-cloud hybrid landscape, and we're trying to manage data across these complex technology landscapes. And the challenge is, of course, every time we increase the complexity, we increase the risk. Every time we move that data, there's a potential for degradation of quality, degradation of ultimately the value of that data. We can introduce inconsistency if we're going through transformation, enrichment, merging, editing processes. So, 60% of organizations are ultimately challenged by their data quality today, and I would say that's a very conservative estimate. So as Paul said, the data asset has enormous value. We know that it can drive the transformational change in the business, and yet we're constantly challenged to understand the assets and manage them effectively. So that's kind of the doom and gloom story, right? It's hard, right? So what's the way forwards? Well, what we've seen is, most organizations today are really looking at defining a really solid data strategy. If they don't have one already, they're really focusing on that. And we'll hear as Mindful talk a little bit, Graham talk a little bit about that towards the end. Now, traditionally, this might have been the remit of the CIO or the head of IT, but more and more we're now seeing that organizations are putting in place, head of data or a CDO into the business. And the first first task of that kind of role, a data governance, data stewardship role, is to get the table stakes in place, which is understand the privacy, the security, the regulatory compliance elements that must be met. That's just the table stakes to play in the data game, right? We have to have those in place. The real next focus is exactly around Paul's DAISY model is how do we help the business derive value from those data assets? Now, I've been around for a while. Don't let my youthful good looks confuse you, but I've been around a while, and back in the day, I used to look at things, work with organizations, and cost reduction would be the big target we were all going for. And we used to apply some really simple models of, well, we'll just take what's our biggest cost, it's our people, so we'll reduce our headcount and we'll drive costs out of the business. Very short term, quite effective, made a few managers and leaders in business look pretty good for a short period of time, but a very short term tactical approach. Organizations are much more mature and much smarter than that today. They want to repurpose, they want to focus the energies of their talented employees into much more dynamic use cases of driving business value. So is it revenue growth? Is it market reputation or operational efficiencies that they're looking to drive? So 82% of CEOs have a management initiative or a transformation program underway to make the company more digital. And I think most of us implicitly understand that better data will result in better business outcomes. But as Paul said, getting that business buy-in and getting that investment is the hard thing. So for those heads of data, the people running the data management programs, for the CDOs, whoever that is, they've got to explicitly demonstrate now the link between better data management and better business outcomes. And that link is critical, right? So what is the return on the investment of investing in your data assets? So understanding the value of those data assets is a critical first step. Understanding where those assets reside, the quality of them, that's also, a critical first point that we need to get across the board. Once we've done that, we can establish particular business goals and objectives that we can achieve with those data assets. So in order to do that, in order to drive those business outcomes and that business value, your data needs to be clean, it needs to be prepared, it needs to be trusted. And there's the old adage that we spend 80% of our time searching and preparing data. And our analysts are still doing that today, 80% of their time. That's a huge investment of effort, and that effort could be applied elsewhere. So there's immediate monetary return on that. I was looking at a piece of research around an organization out of the US, and Paul, forgive me, they took a very simplistic approach here, which was, we've got 100 employees. We did some market research across all our business analysts, and we got them to just answer one simple question: how much time do you spend preparing data? That came back with a percentage. We took their salaries, we multiplied that by that percentage, and it showed us that there was $65 million of employee time investment every year into data preparation. So if we could move the needle, even if it was only by 5, 10, 15, 20 points, it's a significant return to the business in terms of lost time, lost efficiency in managing the data. What's really interesting and compounds this is that a quarter of useful data created in 2018 was actually tagged in order to make it more usable, right? It was metadata tagged, its lineage was understood, its quality was understood. Yet when you go to the final stat here, only 13% of that tag data, so 13% of 25% of all data, was actually used for analysis. And I was talking to a retailer here in New Zealand, a high-end retailer, very efficient, very good at their business. And they said to me, Carl, data is not the problem. We have a massive amount of data. The problem is only 1% of that data is being used to run our business. And when you think about it like that, this is a high-performing retail organization, and you think, what would they look like if they could access and enable the business with that other 99%? It doesn't even bear thinking about. And part of their challenge really is I mentioned earlier that the types and number of consumers of data is significantly increasing. So the data consumption population is increasing exponentially as we have everybody in the business expected to be empowered with data to make decisions. The challenge is the technical knowledge really is on the opposite curve as we go through those different types of users on the business side. They don't have the technical knowledge and skill of our data scientists and our data engineers, but they're expected to use data in a similar way to make sound decisions. And traditionally, organizations have tried to compensate for that with training and enablement, but that doesn't scale. And those practices of the past won't scale to meet the needs of today, let alone the future. What's really needed is we need to meet these business consumers where they are with self-service models tailored to their needs and their technical skill level. And that has taken off in a big way, with new self-service models with the likes of Power BI and Tableau and these visualization tools, which enable them to actually build the reports or the visualizations, but it doesn't solve the data challenge of how do they get to the data, where do they find the data? And that's where the CDO or the head of data is really trying to grapple with this challenge of how do I make my valuable data available to drive business value outcomes. So empowering trusted data use in the business is hard, right? And it requires multiple people, whether you're driving marketing teams looking for that next best offer, whether you've got finance teams doing their financial planning, you're driving management reporting or data ops and model training. You've got to have in place that single view of the self-service access. You've got to have good policies and rules for data quality to ensure the data is trusted. You've got to execute those rules. You've got to cleanse. You've got to enrich. You've got to ensure the data stays clean. Doing it once, is a relatively easy task, but maintaining that and ensuring that level of quality and trust can be maintained at a very high level means you need to then embed those rules into your master data and into your business process. At the same time, as we heard Paul talk about, we've got to make sure the data is protected, both at rest and during that movement, that transition of movement through cloud, through on-premise applications, etc., and deliver that data out. So you need a common approach to your data management that's going to underpin the business to be able to be empowered. And that doesn't matter which industry you're in, what your drivers are for data management. If you're in healthcare and you're trying to do patient data analytics versus whether you're in financial services doing compliance around, BS11 or BCBS 239, it's still the underpinning drivers of data management that's going to service your business and support that. And I talk about, I heard Blake Andrews at New York Life Insurance talk once, and I just took one slide of his really, which was his lessons learned. And for me, when Blake talks, he really talks about having your dessert first, right? Forget about the starter and the main course, get your dessert. And the way you deliver that is, what he thinks good looks like is he focuses on the engaged organization and delivering some business outcomes. And he does that by starting small but thinking big. So how can I go in there and establish a small capability? And this goes back to Paul's DAISY and the different business cases. Identify where that quick win is, understand the value and the impact of that, use that as a proof point, and then grow out from there. And Blake talks about that as how he manages the journey of taking the business through these different priorities, and that helps you establish investment and funding and support from an executive and a stakeholder perspective. And there's lots of good data points. I talked about a retailer earlier. I grabbed a few retail data points of the kind of business value you can achieve through these kinds of programs. If we look at Hubo here, they had a 10 times faster onboarding of new products and suppliers. Now that could be critically important in a retailer to get first market advantage with new product introduction. You look at Klingel, launches products online 7 times faster. You look at Saint-Gobain, 25% less returns. You monetize that as part of the business value conversation, and a 21% increased average basket size. So there are proof points to back this up that we can use to drive that conversation with our leadership. Now, the one thing I talked about was that disconnect with the curve of the number of consumers and how we have a reduced technical capability as we go along that curve. From an Informatica perspective, we really look at how we democratize data out to our end users, and we bring business and IT together. So if you go back 20 years, data governance was a dirty word, and that was all about control. How do we control the data and protect it so that people don't do stuff with it? Today, that's no longer what governance is about. Yes, we have, as I said, table stakes around governance and compliance, but what we're trying to do is bring our business and IT closer. Talked at a Tableau user group a couple of months ago, and the conversation was very much around the traditional gap of the business wants some data to do something. IT will provision that data, and it's a 3-month process because you've got to raise these requirements, you've got to do the forms, they've got to go through, the school got to be validated, then they've got to do the technical build of actually how to connect to that data and bring it through. And it's a 3-month time lag at best. And by the time you get the data, the business has moved on. So what we try to do at Informatica is we bring the business and IT together. So we've come up with a data marketplace where any consumer on that right-hand side of the population, any consumer can go in and, like a shopping cart, can go find data. I've just been asked by my senior leader to run some analysis on customer buying behaviors as an example. I can go into that shopping cart, I can go and find what data assets support that. If I've got access to them and I'm privileged and I've got the rights, I can just go and start working. If I haven't got the rights, I can just request them through workflow in the system, and it will say, right, yes, the data steward will look at that and go, yes, you're entitled to that data, and it's provisioned straight through to me. No more 3-month wait, no more of this backwards and forwards, kind of IT trying to decipher the business requirements and vice versa. So that really simplifies that data journey, lets us get those data assets out in the hands of the business really quickly. So to close, as I hand back to the Mindful guys who will take us on the next steps of the journey. For me, I want organizations to take away from this. If you think big, but you start small on those petals of the daisy, you can scale this thing really fast. Getting started is easy. It doesn't have to be complex. Get in there, understand your data assets, and start working on some of those initial business cases. And then from there, leverage pilots to go broad. And you can really take the data governance piece out into the organization very quickly. So let me now hand this over to Belinda and see if I can work the technology quickly. And again, I'll pick up any questions at the end, Belinda.
Fantastic, wonderful. Thank you so much, Cole. It's wonderful. So I just want to thank everyone for all the questions coming in. We'll answer those towards the end of the session. Really good. So what I thought is I just want to talk to everyone at the moment around some of the use cases that we've seen at Mindful that clients have used to get their data, you know, to go through the data journey. So one of the examples is the New Zealand Transport Agency. They're one of our Crown entities that are very focused on providing that safe and functional transport for land, including the responsibility of drivers and vehicle licensing. And they also work with the Ministry of Transport and Police to make our roads safer. So you guys can see that they do quite a variety of things for the New Zealand transport industry. Now for these guys, the main issue they had with their data, it was a reputational risk. So we engaged with the New Zealand Transport Agency a few years back, and they had a very old data warehouse that was created in a basement with two guys, and over the last years were cobbled together with numerous bits of code. And it really was a huge risk for the transport agency, because as you guys can see, that over 10,000 users looking at the information and 400 entities using the information. And this particular tool set of data held all of the different accidents in the last 25 years in New Zealand. Every accident ever happened had a whole lot of data points around the accident. And this data was used to make decisions around changes in law, was changes, maybe we'd reduce the driving age, maybe we smooth out a bend because there seems to be a lot of accidents in a particular bend. And this database became very unwieldy, and it was a critical decision point, and it was very, very hard to maintain. So because there were so many data opportunities through this, we used a design thinking approach, and we went through all the data and helped the transport agency come up with what are the data opportunities that the business have. And that was a plethora of different data problems that we could deal with. So we used this particular problem around the crash data that they had, and we built them a cloud-based data vault, very quick and easy. It's easy accessible, it's robust, it's secure. So very quick implementation. And what this has allowed the business is that information that is being relied on through the industry and through the police and government, they know is robust, is protected, and is visible to everyone. So really nice little application of how we use data. So for these guys, like Paul was saying, their main issue with the data was that reputational data. A lovely little quote there from our clients, just how fast and quick we did that work. Another one of our clients here is Downer. Now, Downer is an Australian is listed on the Securities Exchange and employs over 53,000 people. And they're over 150 years old, which a lot of you may or may not know. And they have over 300 sites in Australia and New Zealand. And they really do that end-to-end asset management for our business. Now, Paul mentioned that consistency, relevancy, and accuracy of data is critical for businesses. And that was definitely the situation with Downer. They had a whole lot of different disparate systems, duplicated data quality, and they realized that the real value in their business, as Paul mentioned, is not actually all the actual assets they have, but is this data. They have a whole lot of data that is coming into the business, and they wanted to have this data journey. So what we did for these guys is we really took them on an enterprise data catalog journey. And this was only the first step in the journey. Now, Becky, our client there, which is the GM of data and analytics, said that they've used this solution as a step in the data journey to really change the business. There's a little short snippet of video that I'll share with anyone that's interested, where Becky talks around how the business engagement around what are our assets worth, where are we fixing, has now changed around the data. So the discussions at the exec level is really around the data and how they can explore all these data opportunities in the business. And also harnessing all the data that's coming in from different suppliers. I know they get loads from every supplier around how fast the trucks are going, where are they going, what are they doing. So data is becoming prevalent in the business, which is really, really great opportunity. So they are on a data journey. Downer is really great business case and use case for a very traditional business that are seeing the value of data and how they can explore that in their industry and to get a leverage the competitive advantage. So I just thought I'll share 2 little use cases for you guys, local and international, that we've used just to help clients on that data journey. And like Carl is saying, it really is a data journey that we're on. So I'm just going to pass over now to Graham from our team just to take you through maybe some tips and tricks how you can get started on this this data journey that I'm sure we're all onto. Graham.
Yeah, fantastic, Belinda. Thanks so much. And also to Paul and Carol, that's fantastic. It's really good to see the interconnection between obviously valuation and central governance as well. What I really want to bring to the table today is more looking about that start point. I think data is a very, people get a bit kind of, what's that saying, like deer in the headlights, sort of kind of big eyes, don't really know where to start, kind of close up and anxious about the fact that they need to deal with their data because we see the value there. So really what I want to bring to the table is more looking about where is that start line and what do you do as organisations and what do you do as individuals as well. One of the key things that we find time and time again, I think that Downer was a really good example, but we've seen it across a lot of clients and specifically within the financial services, is that we really start to find that even though we say where's the start line for data, well, we all have been using data for such a long time. We look at data continuously, we gain those insights, we gain the analysis, etc. But really what we're finding is that data is quite siloed and segmented across the business. So, you know, say for example, in the finance team, finance look at data, but they're looking at their own pots of data and their own sources, and then they're analysing using their own tools, etc. And we find that across marketing, we see that in HR, we see that in operations, in all different functions of the business. So even though we speak about data, we never ever really end up coming up with that concept that organisations have that central data point. And I know that Carol had mentioned really clearly there that it's great to see CDOs coming into play, and it's great to see companies and organisations starting to really see the value in having that centralised position. And for me, where the value comes in through projects and through engagements with clients, the value comes in that standardisation and that overall governance of what you're doing with data. It's the support. So data has always been a support to produce an insight which gives a concept or an idea on where the business should go. But what it's now starting to show is if we put these centralised depositories and teams in the middle of an organisation to really manage that data, is the relationship between that business strategy and the data. So as that business grows, or if that business starts to really experience you know, challenges within its industry or changes in its consumer, etc., we really need to make sure that our data is controlled in such a way that our whole business is able to adapt to that business change, and it is able to be supported and driven forward through the use of the data. So it's really trying to change that mindset of having data siloed across the portfolio of the business, but bringing it into that centralized location. And one of the key things, and I think that I mean, Paul was a really prime example in this, is that everyone's coming with different mindsets around how much their data is worth. And we need to think as well about our expense towards data. You know, it's great that we've got some amazing, really, really advanced analytical products out there, or great visualization tools. But the reality of the situation is that these tools are only useful if they actually benefit your company. And I know Paul touched on this, but really we need to make sure that that data strategy, that overlying strategy that we've got in handling our data and managing it, is really specific to our company, and not just because it's kind of best approach or something. So it's a really personalized approach we need to take with data. It's not like a one product fits all sort of scenario. But really looking at, okay, if you were to sit back as individuals and ask yourself, how do you start this data journey, if we want to call it that, there's 4 really clear kind of sub-segments to data strategy. Now, I know, Belinda, can you just drop onto the next slide? I don't know if just my system's slow. Yeah, there we go. A lot of people have a lot of concepts about data strategy, and a lot of, you can picture the visuals with all the different pillars, etc. But for me, the starting block for that data strategy is really simple. It is literally about asking those questions. And I know, again, Carol mentioned that, but it's about breaking it down into these 4 horizontals. So you've got the likes of planning and discovery. We need to be set that whatever data solution that you provide to your company today, be that in your own function or be that as an enterprise solution, we need to be really confident that it doesn't just supply benefit to the company today, but there's a longevity, there's an end goal that's a long way away. We need to make sure that it's adjustable. So we need to understand that those business objectives, where's the business going, and can our solutions actually help support that in the long run? You know, and again, it's going back to the concept of who is a stakeholder. it's amazing when we speak with clients and we start discussing, you know, say for example, we're rolling out, I did a great engagement, a year-long engagement with an investment bank, and we're looking at rolling out a smart estate for the bank, over 300 unique buildings across the estate. And it was amazing to see stakeholders. They thought the stakeholders was just the operations team or the building management team. But as we started to realise, the stakeholders are actually the individual employees of the company. Every single employee is a stakeholder to that data. You know, so it's bringing that concept into play about, let's actually really map this and ask all the questions before we actively start on our journey through data. And then moving down, that current state assessment is absolutely key. You know, you need to make sure you know what a source is. You need to make sure that you actually have all those assets. As I say just now, like, we see all these individual, almost like portfolios or individual data sources kicking out about a business. How do you get that centralized view in those data sources? How do we actually know what provides assets to us, data assets to us? And then looking down to that roadmap, it all correlates back to that concept that we need to look at the long-term gain from data. Well, in some cases it comes immediately, but also we need to adapt to those changes. So that roadmap, when we start to integrate new solutions or integrate new processes, be that technical or strategic, we need to also make sure that we are integrating them in the right manner and along the right route. We want to maximize the functionality of these tools and these processes. So let's make sure that that roadmap's really, really well defined from today and moving forward. And it obviously needs to manage and be assessed as we continue. And then that last one there, that number 4, that's the key one again. It all goes back to that business and the growth and the change in your business. Let's ensure our data is able to change and be able to grow and become, and we have a larger handle on the complexity of the data as the business changes and grows. We need to ensure they're correlated. I'm conscious of time there, Belinda. We've only got 4 minutes left, so what I'll do is I'll pass it back over to yourself, and I'm not sure if you want to kick off the Q&A, but I think this has been a great session, so thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Graham. Yeah, we always run out of time because we can talk about these things for ages, and I'm just mindful of everyone's time that they have probably another call to hop on. Before we get into the Q&A, we just want to extend an offer to anyone that's attended the seminar that Paul from EverEdge, myself, and Cole from Informatica, we're going to extend a free 1-hour consultation to anyone that wants to join on a con call, that we can give some insights into your data free of charge. So we'll hop on the call. You can either give us a challenge or your problem or information, or we can just have a general chat around your data. What's capable in your data? How should you deal with this data problem? How do you value this? So please just reach out to us after this webinar and we can have a session which I'm sure everyone's going to really enjoy and find a huge amount of wealth from it. So we'll touch base with everyone after this. There was quite a few questions around the recordings. We will definitely share this recording with everyone that's attended, and also that videos that I referred to my presentation around the downer data story. So we will make sure that everyone has that. And we have a few minutes left for some questions. Thank you everyone for sending those great questions. And I love the one about I didn't even know that what do you call it, EBITDA DAC, which I love. I had to Google it quickly. Earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, amortization, and coronavirus. I love it. I think everyone's going to bring that hierarchy into their financials. So we got 2 minutes, guys. Who wants to answer a few of the questions? Maybe Paul do one and Cole do one.
Yeah, sure. And just to clarify on Belinda's point, that the 1 hour presentation, the 1 hour discussion, that's obviously one-on-one with individual clients. So yeah, if there's about 150 people been on this call, so hopefully you don't all come at once. But we'll give an hour to any company wants to sit down and talk over with MindFULL Informatica and EverEdge. Now, I think the question I'd ask is, I'm going to ask one answer here, is how heavily does data privacy and consent factor in your data valuation model? The answer is very heavily, and it's really simple. If you're violating, data privacy laws or for example, consent, that kind of thing, then that petal falls off your daisy. right? That's the best way to think about it. That's the reason why we look at data quality initially, and then you draw all your end use cases around the daisy, and then you pull off those petals on the daisy. You simply can't go there. If you don't do that and you value the data set, for example, with reference to those petals included, you're kidding yourself. It's like saying, well, you know, I've got this great new business model for my industrial conglomerate, and one of the business arms is going to be shipping cocaine. Well, if you're not allowed to ship cocaine, then you shouldn't include it in your revenue. So yeah, absolutely, privacy, consent factor heavily influences, and not just the legal component, but the moral and reputational risk component as well is another big factor. So that'll be my answer to that question. Carl, across to you, mate.
Yeah, I've got a good question here, which is with the value of data being linked to business context. And Paul, I'll just give a quick answer here. I might ask you to chime in as well. With the value of data being linked to business context, how is this impacted by our increasing VUCA environment? Volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. So, you know, that's absolutely everything that we're really talking about here, is the volatility and the nature of business today. And the whole premise that we talked about was about no longer the governance of 20 years ago of protecting information, but actually democratizing information out to the business. So, you know, as we see volatility increase, and COVID's been a wonderful example of that, getting the data into the hands of the people who are making decisions faster at the front office is critical to success. And it's less about perfection. It's less about we need everything sorted before we can provide data and it's about getting it there quickly as best we can in the best possible quality and format we can get it to the business to make a decision with, but not at the expense of we spend 3 to 6 months just, you know, thinking about data and, you know, spending hours, you know, just cleaning it and tidying it to get it 100% right. You know, the old 80-20, 80% good enough, let's go, let's make decisions. And if they're the wrong decisions, let's fail fast on them so we're not continuing to throw money into that pit. So yeah, that volatility, that uncertainty in business is certainly driving the need and certainly creating really interesting conversations about how we get the data out and empower the business as fast as possible to make the decisions at the front line. And I guess, Paul, the question to you is, does that volatility and uncertainty impact the valuation of the data? Because, you know, it's an asset that, as I alluded to, probably depreciates over time, right?
Yeah, it does. I mean, the economic conditions in which any business find itself necessarily impacts the value of the assets. But, and this is the critical point, is that the value of the data to you, for example, might be different than its value to somebody else. So even if your business is undergoing a particular challenge or right now, and as in the example I gave, where it was worth, you know, essentially 4 times EBITDA in the hand of the business, and to somebody else is worth 32 times EBITDA, it can be worth more to somebody else. So one of the other things you can think about with your data is, okay, if it's worth this much to me, could it be worth a lot more to somebody else who may not be experiencing the same business conditions or may be in a better situation? I mean, classic case in point, if you had a data set that told you exactly which was the right drug to test for COVID, right? Well, it was worth not much in November, it's worth an enormous amount now. So yes, it's always contextually dependent.
Thank you so much for that. I'm mindful we running out of time. I just want to, a last question I've had here, for a really good one from Fiona, saying, is this only for large, medium-sized enterprises, or can it be for tiny entrepreneurial business? Great question, Fiona, I love it. I think we do a lot of work with big, large organizations where their data have become unwielding. It's everywhere, it's not protected, it's duplicated, and they struggle to get hold of their data. And it's just a result of them growing as a business so fast and not having a clear data strategy, how they're going to grow their strategy. So I think if you're a small business setting up and your vision is to grow large, be global, you know, dominate the world, sell the business for millions, then this is a really great step, even though you're small and nimble, to get set up. What is the data that you're going to go through in your journey, and how are you going to protect it? Where are you going to put it? How are you going to make sure that that value grow, and that if we ever get a big buyer, it's nice and clean. You save yourself millions of dollars later up cleaning up your data mess later on. So great question. Thanks for that, Fiona. So we will, if we haven't answered your question, we will get back to you and give you an answer. We will also send out the recording, as I mentioned, and also send out that offer of the hour. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. I know it's difficult times. Love this lounge data session. I hope you all enjoyed it and found some nuggets in there that you can use in your business. And thank you for all the presenters coming on, spending the time with us.
Cool. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Have a great day.